Hi, today I want to talk about content providers. There are two videos in this section. The first is explanation of what content providers are, and the second we'll be doing a demo showing a simple content provider, actually the Contacts content provider that's supplied for us in the Android device. Content providers are used to store and retrieve data sets. They are the only way that we have to share data amongst applications on our device. There is no other shared data storage for applications other than the content providers. And the Android system has several content providers internally, the contacts, audio, video, images, and so forth, that allow us to interact with the system and the Android device and the objects that are on that device, such as a contact list with phone numbers and email, any videos and audios and images that the user might have on the device. If we have the appropriate permissions set up in our Android manifest file, we can look into those, we can add and delete images, and so forth. Content providers provide us with a common interface through a content resolver object. And we get a content resolver very simply. I have an example piece of code here where we instantiate content resolver and then assign it the return value from get content resolver. Now, get content resolver is part of the activity object. So that will be available to you if the correct headers are imported. We never instantiate system content provider objects. The system is going to take care of that. So the contact list and all of those, they are instantiated by the system, and we can just get them. Data is exposed as a table. Once we make a query to one of these content providers, the data will be exposed in a cursor as a table of columns and rows, where each row is a record of our data set, and the columns are the names of each piece of that data set. And we need to know not only the name of that column, but also the data type of that column in order to interact with it. So a query against a content provider returns a cursor, and I'm going to say this over and over in this presentation because this is a very important concept when working with content providers. Every content provider has a public URI, which is exposed as a URI object. That's going to be a globally unique identifier of the data set that it contains. And all content provider URIs begin with content : much as a internet URI might begin with HTTP : all of our content provider URIs are going to begin with content : The Android system content providers all have a constant, and in this case we can see that content URI, all uppercase, is the constant that encompasses this content : and then the correct URI for this particular piece of content or this content provider. So android.provider.contacts.phones.content URI will give us the correct URI for the contacts. All content resolver methods are going to take this URI as their first argument. In other words, they need to know where to point in order to get the information. So we need three pieces of information to actually query a content provider and interpret the information we get back in the cursor. We need the URI for the provider, we need the names of the fields and the data that we want, and we need the data types for those named fields. So queries are called either by calling the content resolver.query method or the content resolver.managed query method. Usually we'll call the managed query method because the cursor that's returned from a managed query is going to be lifecycle managed by the activity. So if we call the query method, we need to manage our own kind of lifecycle on that cursor. We will usually make use of the managed query method and allow the system, the activity, to manage the life cycle of the cursor. The first argument, as I already said, is going to be the URI. We can optionally append a string to the URI, which specifies a specific ID for the record in the data set. This is if we were looking for one specific record that we already know the ID of. There's some helper methods to simplify things when we're looking for a specific ID. We can have content URIs dot with appended ID, where we take the path and then an integer ID, or content URIs with appended path, and this does the same thing, except here we specify the ID as a string. It just depends on whether you've stored this ID internally as an integer or a string. So queries get back a cursor, as I said before, by calling that query or managed query method with the URI as the first argument. So here we're getting back a cursor called cur, where we call managed query, and the managed query returns the cursor, and the first argument is the URI. The second argument is an array of data column names, and these are stored as strings, but the data column names for our Android content providers are all in as constant strings. So we create an array and then pass it as the second argument. The third argument is going to be our SQL where clause, where we omit the actual keyword where. But here we're looking, what we're really doing here with a managed query is building a SQL select query. It doesn't look like it, but we can pass it a specific where clause. The next argument is going to be if we have any replaceable parameters, question mark type parameters in our SQL query, we would put them here. And the last argument is the sort order, where it's an SQL order by clause where we omit the order by. And we can say where we sort by a particular column and then append ASC for ascending or DESC for descending. If you know SQL already, this will make a lot more sense than if you don't. We do have a section later in the course where we talk about SQLite, and we will be looking at building our own content providers when we look at that section. So now we get back to cursor object, and the cursor object is going to contain rows and columns as the result of the query. We can then use some methods to move backward and forward within the cursor to get specific rows, but we can't read the row as a whole. We have to read specific field data. This cursor object, when we query it with query or managed query, is only going to be readable. We can't write. We can't add a row or modify a field or delete rows or update or anything else. We can only read. If we need to do some of these other operations, we'll need to use content resolver on that query. We can read only from specific fields. We have to know the data type, and then we can read the value for the fields. As I said, this goes along with my statement earlier that we can't read the entire row. We can only read specific fields from that row. So if we want to modify data, we need a method of content resolver to do this. So we will need a content resolver object. And then there are three methods: insert, update, and delete. So insert is where we would add a row. We would give it the URI because all methods of content resolver expect a URI as their first argument. And then we would give it the values. And the values, we use the content values class. We instantiate one of those, and then we use put, .put, which is a method of content values, to put various values in, and then we pass that object to the insert method. And this would allow us to insert a row into our database, into our content provider data store. Update, similarly, we pass it the URI, we pass it the nice content values, And then we have a where clause. And if we have any selection args, the replaceable parameter arguments, we would pass those as well. If we don't have a selection clause, we can pass null here. We don't want to pass null as a where clause, typically, unless we want to update every record in the content provider. So remember, a general SQL rule, when you run an update query, you want to provide a where clause. So this will update all rows corresponding to its where clause with the content values. So the where clause typically is going to be where a specific column is of this value, and then the content values are going to pass in the replacement values for that specific column that you're looking for. And delete, pass a URI, and then we can only delete with a specific ID. Now we might go out and look for the ID where the name is such and such, or the phone number starts with so and so, and get that ID back, and then query delete or content resolver.delete that row. Now, in order to insert an update or delete, we need to add the appropriate permissions to Android manifest.xml, and we'll talk about those. Every content provider has a list of permissions associated with it. And so in that manifest file, we need to supply the permissions that this application is expected to comply with in order to use some of these methods, specifically adding a row, updating a row, or deleting a row. The reason for this, these security settings, is because we don't want to allow an application on a device that can just go in and delete all of your contacts or remove all of your images unless the user has agreed that those permissions should be allowed. In the next section of this presentation, I'm going to show a demo, and we are not going to be modifying any data. We're just going to look at the records of the content database and take a look at how we do that. The reason we're not modifying any data in this particular demo is that this is going to get into security permissions in the Android manifest file, and that is going to be discussed actually in, let me look here, that's going to be discussed in week 7 as we discuss security and permissions. And also, we do have a section on SQLite, which we'll be discussing in week 9. And when we get to those sections, we'll look at, again, content providers and how we do adding and updating and deleting rows from those content providers. And we'll also be looking at, later in the course, how to create our own content providers, which we will need to have a knowledge of SQLite in order to do that. So for now, our next video is on a demo on content providers. Thank you.